Go ahead, she said softly, almost amused. Once the will clears, none of this will be yours to worry about anyway. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there in the hallway of the house I grew up in, key still in my hand, listening to a woman I had never met casually rewrite my future like I was already gone. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried. It settled into the walls like it belonged there. My brother's voice came next, low, confident, the same tone he used whenever he thought he was the smartest person in the room. Exactly. Once everything transfers, we can finally make decisions without complications. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. I was the complication. I had driven 6 hours that morning without calling ahead, without texting, without giving anyone the chance to prepare a version of the house that didn't include conversations like this. Something in me had been unsettled for weeks, missed calls, vague answers, my mother's sudden change in tone whenever I asked about paperwork, about Dad's health, about the house. It wasn't one thing. It was the absence of things that used to be normal. So I showed up. Unannounced. And what I walked into wasn't confusion or surprise. It was planning. Careful, quiet planning that didn't include me. I stepped forward just enough to see them through the half-open dining room door. My brother stood near the table, one hand resting on the back of Dad's chair like it already belonged to him. And beside him, his girlfriend, perfect posture, perfectly styled, smiling the kind of smile that looks warm from a distance and calculated up close. She had a folder in front of her. Papers. Organized. Highlighted. My mother sat across from them, hands folded too neatly in her lap, eyes shifting between the two of them like she was trying to keep up with a conversation she didn't fully control. My father wasn't speaking. He was just there. Quiet in a way that didn't feel like rest. We just need to make sure everything is aligned before the attorney finalizes it, the girlfriend continued, tapping one of the pages lightly. Once it's done, there won't be any room for misunderstandings. My brother nodded, like this was all reasonable, like I was a detail that had already been resolved. She won't push back, he said. She never does. That landed harder than anything else. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. I had spent years being the one who kept things smooth, who didn't argue, who made sure holidays stayed peaceful, who filled in the gaps no one else wanted to deal with. And somewhere along the way, that had been translated into permission. Permission to speak over me. Plan around me. Erase me quietly. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I let the silence stretch just a second longer, long enough to hear how far they were willing to go without me in the room. It's just cleaner this way, she added, her voice lowering slightly, more intimate now. No conflict. No emotional complications. Everything stays contained. Contained. Like I was something messy that needed to be managed. That was the word that finally made something in me go still instead of reactive. Not angry. Not loud. Just clear. I stepped fully into the doorway then, heels soft against the hardwood, just enough sound to shift the air without announcing myself outright. My brother noticed first. His posture changed before his face did, like his body recognized a problem before his mind caught up. Then his eyes lifted. Then hers. And in that exact moment, I watched it happen, the smallest fracture in her expression. The smile didn't drop all at once. It hesitated. It faltered. Like it needed a second to understand why I was there. Why I was real. Why I wasn't a problem they had already solved on paper. I met her gaze calmly, offering a polite, measured smile of my own, the kind that says I heard everything without needing to repeat it. I'm sorry, I said gently, my voice even, respectful, almost warm. I didn't realize I needed an invitation to walk into my own family's home. And that was the moment her smile disappeared completely. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because no one had expected to need an explanation. My brother recovered first, the way he always did, straightening slightly, adjusting his tone like he could reshape the moment if he stayed calm enough. "Tige," he said, forcing a small smile that did not reach his eyes, "you should have told us you were coming. We would have prepared." Prepared. The word hung there, careful and deliberate, as if my presence required staging. I set my keys down gently on the console table by the doorway, taking in the room without rushing, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind them I was not the one caught off guard. "I did not realize my arrival required preparation," I replied, my voice even, polite, the kind of tone that never raises but never yields. My mother shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening together, a nervous habit she had never quite hidden. "We were just having a discussion," she said quickly, too quickly, her eyes flicking toward the folder on the table before returning to me. "Nothing finalized." I nodded slightly, as if considering that, then glanced toward the papers without stepping closer. "Of course," I said. "Discussions are important." The girlfriend had not spoken yet. She was watching me carefully now, recalculating, measuring the distance between what she had assumed and what was actually standing in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, more controlled, but there was a tension underneath it that had not been there earlier. "It is nice to finally meet you," she said, extending a hand that I noticed she held just a fraction longer than necessary, as if asserting composure through precision. "I have heard quite a bit about you." I accepted the gesture with a small, courteous nod, meeting her handshake with equal calm. "I am sure you have," I replied, holding her gaze just long enough to let the weight of that statement settle before releasing it. My brother cleared his throat, stepping slightly forward as if to re-establish control of the room. "We were just going over some estate details," he said, gesturing lightly toward the documents. "Nothing that cannot wait." That was interesting. Not that it existed, but that it was suddenly something that could wait. I walked further into the room then, slow, unhurried, as if I belonged there. Without needing to prove it, taking a seat at the table without asking, choosing the chair that had always been mine growing up. No one stopped me. No one told me otherwise. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how much of this had been built on assumption rather than certainty. "I would not want to interrupt anything important," I said, folding my hands lightly in front of me, posture relaxed but intentional. "Please, continue." My father finally looked up at me then, really looked, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not quite guilt. Not quite relief. Something closer to uncertainty. "We can go over it later," he said quietly, his voice lacking the firmness it once carried so easily. The girlfriend glanced at my brother, just for a second, but it was enough. A silent question. A silent recalibration. My brother hesitated, then nodded once, too quickly, like he was agreeing to something he had not fully thought through. "Yes," he said. "Later makes more sense." I let a small pause settle before speaking again, not interrupting, not pushing, just placing my words carefully where they would carry the most weight. "It is always better to have everyone present when discussing something that affects the entire family," I said gently, my tone measured, almost considerate. "It helps avoid misunderstandings." That word again. Misunderstandings. This time I watched how it landed. My mother looked down. My brother's jaw tightened slightly. And the girlfriend, for the first time since I walked in, did not immediately respond. Instead, she reached for the folder, closing it with a controlled motion, aligning the edges of the papers inside as if restoring order on the surface could fix what had already shifted underneath. "Of course," she said finally, her voice steady again, but not quite as effortless as before. "Clarity is important." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it outright. "It is," I said. And then I let the silence return, not empty this time, but full of everything they had not planned for, everything they had assumed would remain unchallenged, everything that had just become visible the moment I chose not to stay quiet. No one reopened the folder, but no one moved it away either. It stayed at the center of the table like a quiet admission that something had already been decided before I walked in. I rested my hands lightly against each other, not tense, not defensive, just present, and let my eyes move across the room in a way that made it clear I was not guessing anymore. I drove up this morning, I said calmly, directing my voice toward my parents, not my brother, not her. 6 hours is enough time to think about what has not been said. My mother glanced up at that, her expression tightening, the kind of reaction that only comes when someone realizes silence has been noticed, not mistaken for peace. You could have called, she said, her tone softer now, but careful, like she was trying to keep the situation contained. We would have made sure everything was clear. I gave a small, polite nod. I am beginning to understand that, I replied, letting the words settle without pushing them further. My brother shifted his weight slightly, the confidence he carried earlier now reduced to something more measured, more watchful. There is no need to read into things, he said, his voice steady but no longer relaxed. We are just trying to simplify the process. That is all. Simplify. Another word chosen for comfort, not accuracy. I looked at him briefly, not confrontational, just direct enough that he could not pretend I had missed the implication. Simplifying something usually requires agreement, I said evenly. Otherwise, it is simply rearranging control. That landed exactly where it needed to. He did not respond right away. He could not. The girlfriend stepped in then, her composure returning piece by piece, her posture straightening as if she had decided to approach this differently. I believe there has been a misunderstanding, she said, her tone professional now, almost practiced. We were only discussing possibilities based on the current structure. Nothing has been executed. I turned to her fully for the first time, giving her my attention without hostility, but without softness either. That is reassuring, I said, my voice level. Because it would be unfortunate to plan outcomes without verifying the foundation. Her expression held, but I could see the calculation behind it, the quiet shift from confidence to caution. She was not dismissing me anymore. She was assessing me. Good. That meant she understood this was no longer a conversation she controlled. My father exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly in his chair, as if the weight of the room had finally reached him. We should go through everything together, he said, more to the table than to any one person. Properly. That word mattered. Properly. It suggested that what had been happening before did not meet that standard. My mother looked at him, surprised, then at me, as if trying to determine how much had already been lost in the shift. That would be best, I said quietly, acknowledging his decision without claiming it as a victory. The girlfriend placed both hands on the closed folder, her fingers resting lightly on the edge, not opening it, not pushing it away. Holding it. Then we should schedule a time with the attorney where everyone is present, she said, her tone composed again, but this time there was no assumption underneath it. Just structure. Just formality. That way there is no confusion. I inclined my head slightly. Clarity tends to prevent unnecessary complications, I replied, letting the phrase echo just enough to remind her where this had started. My brother let out a small breath through his nose, not quite frustration, not quite acceptance, but something in between. Fine, he said. We can do that. It was the first time he had agreed to something without trying to shape it first. That, more than anything else, told me how much had already shifted. I leaned back slightly in my chair, relaxed, composed, and allowed the silence to return again, but this time it felt different. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just quiet in a way that comes when something unspoken has finally been acknowledged without needing to be explained. I did not press further. I did not ask questions I already knew the direction of. I simply let them sit with the fact that I had arrived before the plan was finished. Before the narrative had been secured, before I could be positioned as absent. And in that space, without raising my voice, without arguing, without forcing anything, I had already changed the outcome in a way none of them had prepared for. The conversation did not continue, but the room did not relax either. Everyone stayed exactly where they were, as if moving too quickly might confirm something none of them were ready to admit yet. I let a few seconds pass, then reached for the glass of water that had been sitting untouched near my usual place, taking a slow sip, not because I needed it, but because it gave them time to sit with what had just shifted. "When was the last time we all sat down like this?" I asked quietly, setting the glass back down with care, and spoke about something that actually involved everyone equally. It was not an accusation. It was worse. It was a question they could not answer without exposing the truth. My mother looked toward my father again, searching for direction, but he did not offer any this time. He remained still, his attention fixed somewhere between the table and the floor, like he was reconsidering something that had already gone too far. My brother leaned back slightly, crossing his arms in a way that was meant to look composed but felt more like distance. "You are making this into something it is not," he said, his tone controlled, but no longer confident. I turned my head toward him slowly, not reacting to the words, only acknowledging them. "Then help me understand what it is," I replied, my voice calm, almost inviting, giving him the space to define it himself. That was the moment he hesitated again. Because defining it meant committing to a version of events that would not hold under scrutiny. The girlfriend stepped in once more, but this time she did not speak immediately. She adjusted the edge of the folder again, aligning it with the table as if precision could restore authority. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted from confident to careful professionalism. "Your parents have been under a great deal of pressure," she said. "We were simply trying to create a structure that would reduce stress and provide clarity moving forward." I nodded slightly, acknowledging the effort in her explanation. "Structure can be helpful," I said, my tone even. "As long as it reflects reality." I let that settle, then added, just enough to redirect the focus without raising tension, "and reality includes everyone whose name is still on record." This time I did not look at my brother. I looked directly at her. It was subtle, but intentional. She understood immediately. Her posture stiffened just enough to confirm it. My mother inhaled quietly, her fingers tightening again. "Tige," she said softly, "no one is trying to exclude you." I met her gaze, not cold, not accusing, just steady. "Intentions are not always what create outcomes," I replied gently. "Sometimes it is what is assumed in their absence." My father finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, but more grounded. "Nothing has been finalized," he said. "Nothing will be finalized without going through it together." That statement changed the air in the room more than anything else. Not because it solved anything, but because it set a boundary that had not been there before. My brother's expression tightened slightly, just enough to reveal the shift beneath his composure. "That was always the plan," he said quickly, but the timing of it made it sound less like truth and more like correction. I did not challenge it. I did not need to. The contrast had already been established. The girlfriend exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, as if she had accepted that the conversation was no longer moving in the direction she had prepared for. "Then we will proceed accordingly," she said, her tone composed again, but now entirely formal. "No familiarity. No assumption. Just distance." I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement, then allowed my attention to move back to the table, to the space where the folder still rested, unopened, unclaimed. It was no longer a tool. It was a question. And no one seemed willing to answer it first. I leaned back slightly, maintaining the same calm posture I had held since I walked in, and let the silence expand again, not empty, not tense, but filled with something far more difficult to ignore. Awareness. Not of what had been said, but of what could no longer be hidden now that I was there, present, listening, and no longer willing to remain outside of decisions that were quietly shaping my place in a family that had almost learned to function without asking whether I should still be included. I did not reach for the folder, and I noticed that no one else did either. It stayed there, centered on the table like something that had already been decided in private but could no longer survive in the open. I let my fingers rest lightly against the surface in front of me, then glanced toward my father, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to bring his attention back into the conversation without calling it out directly. "When did the attorney last update the documents?" I asked quietly, my tone measured, neutral, as if I were asking about something routine rather than something that had just shifted the entire balance in the room. My father hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "About 3 weeks ago," he said finally. 3 weeks. That aligned too neatly with the change in tone, the missed calls, the vague answers. I nodded once, absorbing it without reacting. "That is helpful," I said. My brother leaned forward slightly, his patience thinning now that the structure of the conversation was no longer in his control. "We were going to bring you in once everything was organized," he said, his voice tighter than before. There was no reason to complicate it early. I turned my head toward him slowly, not confronting, just present. "Early for whom?" I asked gently. He did not answer immediately, and that pause said more than anything he could have offered. The girlfriend shifted her posture again, this time leaning in slightly, her voice controlled but carrying a new edge, something sharper beneath the professionalism. "It is standard practice to streamline before involving additional parties," she said. "It prevents unnecessary conflict." I met her gaze steadily, my expression unchanged. "Conflict does not come from involvement," I replied calmly. "It comes from exclusion being discovered." That was the first time her composure slipped in a way she could not fully mask. Not visibly enough for anyone less attentive to notice, but enough for me. Enough to confirm that she understood exactly what I was saying. My mother spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "We did not think you would see it that way." I looked at her, really looked, and for a moment there was something older there, something that had nothing to do with documents or signatures or control. "That may be the problem," I said softly. "Not what you intended. But what you assumed I would accept." My father exhaled slowly again, this time heavier, like the weight of what had been left unspoken was finally settling into something real. "No one is signing anything until we sit down together with the attorney," he said firmly, more grounded than before. "That is final." The word final carried differently this time. Not as a conclusion, but as a correction. My brother's jaw tightened, and he leaned back again, his arms crossing once more, but this time it was not composure. It was resistance. "That is going to delay everything," he said. I did not respond to him directly. Instead, I shifted my attention back to the table, letting the silence stretch just long enough before speaking again. "Delays tend to reveal whether something was built on stability or urgency," I said evenly. "If it holds, then nothing is lost." The girlfriend closed her eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recalibration, then opened them again with a composed, neutral expression. "We will adjust the timeline," she said. No argument. No pushback. Just acceptance of a structure she no longer controlled. That told me more than anything else. My mother looked between all of us, her expression unsettled, like she was trying to understand how something that had felt contained just minutes ago had expanded beyond her ability to manage it. "We just wanted things to be easier," she said quietly. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her without agreeing. "Easier is not always the same as fair," I replied. No one answered that. They could not. Because fairness requires visibility. And visibility had just been restored in a way none of them had prepared for. I leaned back slightly again, my posture relaxed, my voice no longer needed, and allowed the room to settle into a new kind of silence. Not avoidance. Not denial. Just awareness. They were no longer discussing a plan. They were sitting inside the reality of one that had almost been completed without me. And now, whether they admitted it or not, every step forward would have to pass through the one thing they had tried to avoid. Me. No one reached for anything after that. Not the folder, not their phones, not even the usual distractions people use when they want to escape a conversation without admitting it. The room held still in a way that felt deliberate, like everyone was waiting for someone else to make the next move, to say something that would shift control back into something familiar. I did not give them that. I let the silence sit, steady and unbroken, because sometimes the most honest thing in a room is what no one is willing to say out loud. After a few seconds, I stood up slowly, not abruptly, not in a way that suggested tension, just enough movement to remind them that I was not rooted to that chair, not dependent on staying in that space to be heard. I am going to get some air, I said calmly, my tone polite, composed, as if this were an ordinary visit, as if nothing had just been exposed. My mother looked up immediately, concern flickering across her face. You just got here, she said. I gave her a small, reassuring smile, the kind that softens without conceding anything. And I will still be here when I come back, I replied gently. No one stopped me as I walked toward the back door. Not my brother, not her, not even my father. That was the first clear sign that the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer trying to control my presence. They were adjusting to it. The late afternoon air outside was cooler than I expected, carrying that quiet stillness that comes just before evening settles in. I stepped onto the patio and let the door close softly behind me, the sound final but not dramatic. For a moment, I just stood there, looking out across the yard I had known my entire life, taking in how familiar everything looked. And how different it felt. Inside, they were probably speaking now. Not loudly, not openly, but in that careful, lowered way people use when they know the situation has changed and they need to recalibrate without being overheard. I did not need to listen. I already knew the direction of that conversation. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the railing, steady, grounded, and let my thoughts settle into something clearer. This was never just about documents. It was about positioning. About who was assumed to lead, who was expected to follow, and who could be quietly moved aside without resistance. And for a long time I had allowed that structure to exist without questioning it, not because I agreed with it, but because I valued stability more than confrontation. That was no longer the case. The back door opened a few minutes later, and I did not turn right away. I recognized the sound of my father's steps before he spoke. You handled that calmly, he said, his voice low, almost reflective. I nodded slightly, still looking out toward the yard. Calm tends to reveal more than reaction, I replied. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away, not intruding, not asserting, just present in a way that felt different from before. Things moved faster than they should have, he said after a moment. I let that sit, then answered carefully. Speed is not the issue, I said. Direction is. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that settling into something he could not dismiss. You think we were heading in the wrong direction, he said. I turned then, meeting his gaze directly, not confrontational, just clear. I think decisions were being shaped without full awareness of what they affect, I said. And that rarely leads anywhere stable. He did not argue. That was the second sign things had changed. He simply nodded once, slower this time, like he was acknowledging something he had not fully considered before. We will go through everything properly, he said. Together. I held his gaze for a moment longer, then inclined my head slightly. That would be appropriate, I replied. Inside the house, through the glass, I could see my brother and his girlfriend standing near the table, speaking in low voices, their posture no longer aligned the way it had been earlier. There was space between them now. Not distance, but difference. And that told me everything I needed to know. The plan had not just been interrupted. It had been exposed. And once something is exposed, it cannot return to what it was before, no matter how carefully someone tries to reconstruct it. I turned back toward the yard, letting the quiet settle again, not as an escape, but as a pause. Because I knew what came next would not be louder. It would be sharper. And this time, it would not rely on what they assumed. It would rely on what I chose to reveal, and when. I stayed outside a moment longer than necessary, not because I needed the air, but because timing mattered now more than anything I could say. Inside, they were adjusting, recalculating, trying to decide what version of this situation they could still control. I let them have that moment. Then I turned and walked back in. The room quieted again the second the door closed behind me, not abruptly, not obviously, but enough that the shift was undeniable. No one resumed their previous positions. No one reached for the folder. That was new. I stepped back to the table and took my seat without hesitation, my movement steady, deliberate, as if I had never left. "We should not delay further," I said calmly, my voice even, not raised, not forceful, just placed exactly where it needed to be. "If we are going to move forward properly, then it is better to clarify everything now." My brother looked at me, his expression guarded now, no longer confident, no longer dismissive. "We already agreed to meet with the attorney," he said. I nodded slightly. "And we will," I replied. "But there are details that do not require scheduling to acknowledge." The girlfriend watched me closely, her posture still composed, but no longer relaxed. "What specifically are you referring to?" she asked, her tone controlled, professional, but careful. I met her gaze directly, not with confrontation, but with clarity. "The assumption that the current structure reflects the actual ownership of this property," I said. That was the moment. Everything shifted. Not visibly at first, but in the way the room held still, in the way no one interrupted, in the way even my brother did not respond immediately. My father looked up sharply, his attention fully engaged now. "What do you mean?" he asked. I did not rush the answer. I let a brief pause settle, just enough to ensure that when I spoke, they were listening for the right reason. "I mean," I said calmly, "that before any decisions are discussed, it would be appropriate to confirm whose name is legally attached to this house in its current form." My brother let out a small breath, almost a scoff, trying to recover control. "That is already documented," he said quickly. "We know exactly how it is structured." I turned my attention to him, not sharply, just enough to hold his focus. "Do you?" I asked quietly. That question did not challenge him. It exposed him. The girlfriend shifted slightly, her fingers tightening just a fraction against the edge of the table, the first real sign of tension she had not been able to conceal. "The records were reviewed," she said, her tone still composed, but no longer effortless. "Everything aligns with the current estate plan." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her statement without agreeing. "That would be reassuring," I said. "If those records had not been amended." Silence. Not hesitation. Silence. My father leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, but more focused than it had been all day. "Amended how?" he asked. I reached into my bag then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple, controlled motion, and placed a single document on the table in front of me. I did not slide it toward anyone. I did not explain it immediately. I simply let it sit there, visible, present. "The title was updated last year," I said calmly. "After the refinancing." My brother frowned slightly, confusion breaking through his composure. "That does not change the ownership structure," he said. I looked at him, not with irritation, not with satisfaction, just with clarity. "It does," I replied. My father reached for the paper first, his hand slower than usual, like he already understood that whatever he was about to read would not align with what he had assumed. His eyes moved across the document, and I watched the moment it registered. Not shock. Not anger. Something quieter. Realization. My mother leaned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He handed the paper toward her instead. The girlfriend stepped closer then, her attention fixed on the document, her composure tightening in a way that was no longer subtle. My brother remained still, but I could see the shift in him, the way certainty was being replaced by something less stable. I folded my hands lightly in front of me again, my posture unchanged, my voice no longer needed. Because the truth did not require explanation anymore. It was already sitting in front of them. And for the first time since I walked into that room, no one was speaking. Not because they did not have something to say, but because they were finally seeing something they had never thought to question. And that was the moment everything they had planned stopped belonging to them. My father's hand did not shake, but it slowed in a way I had never seen before. He read the document again, this time more carefully, like he was searching for a line that would return things to what he thought they were. It did not exist. My mother leaned closer, her eyes scanning the page, her expression tightening with each second that passed. This cannot be right, she said quietly, not to me, not to anyone in particular, just into the space between what she believed and what was written. I did not interrupt her. I did not correct her. I let the document do what it was meant to do. My brother finally stepped forward, reaching for the paper with a sharper movement than anyone else had made so far. "Let me see that," he said, his voice controlled but strained at the edges. My father handed it to him without resistance. That alone was new. He read it once, quickly, then again, slower, his jaw tightening as the meaning settled in. "This is just a refinancing adjustment," he said, but the confidence was gone. It sounded like a conclusion he was trying to force into place rather than something he understood. I met his gaze calmly. "It is a refinancing adjustment," I replied. "And a title update." The girlfriend stepped closer then, her attention fixed on the document, her composure narrowing into focus. "There must be an addendum," she said, her tone precise, almost clinical now. "Something that clarifies the ownership distribution." I inclined my head slightly. "There is," I said. "On the second page." That was when the shift became visible. Not just in posture, but in expression. She turned the page carefully, her fingers steady, but slower than before, like she already anticipated what she was about to read. My brother watched her, not speaking, not interrupting, just waiting. And then she stopped. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just stopped. Her eyes remained on the page, but whatever she had expected to find there had been replaced by something else entirely. Something she had not prepared for. My mother looked between them, her voice uncertain now. "What does it say?" she asked. The girlfriend did not answer immediately. That hesitation said more than anything else. Finally, she spoke, but her tone had changed. It was still controlled, still measured, but the certainty was gone. "The property is no longer solely under your father's name," she said slowly. "It was restructured during the refinance." My father closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, his focus shifting toward me with a clarity that had not been there earlier. "Whose name?" he asked. I held his gaze, not with challenge, not with satisfaction, just with quiet certainty. "Mine," I said. No one spoke after that. Not immediately. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. My brother looked back down at the document, as if reading it again might produce a different answer. "That does not make sense," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Why would that be done without?" He stopped himself. "Because the answer was already there." The girlfriend set the paper down carefully, aligning it with the table as she had done before, but this time the gesture did not restore control. It revealed the absence of it. "This changes the entire structure," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "It does." My mother looked at me then, her expression no longer defensive, no longer dismissive, just uncertain in a way that felt unfamiliar. "Why did you not tell us?" she asked. I considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because no one asked," I said gently. That landed harder than anything else I had said. Not because it was harsh, but because it was true. My father leaned back slowly, the weight of the realization settling into something he could not ignore. "This means," he began, then stopped, recalculating. "This means nothing moves forward without your approval." I nodded once. "That would be correct," I said. My brother exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, the frustration no longer contained beneath composure. "This was never part of the plan," he said. I looked at him calmly. "That depends on whose plan you are referring to," I replied. The girlfriend did not speak again. She did not need to. Her silence, her stillness, the absence of that earlier confidence, said everything. The structure she had been building no longer existed. Not because it had been destroyed, but because it had never actually been hers to control. I folded my hands lightly in front of me once more, my posture unchanged, my voice steady. "We can still proceed," I said. "But this time it will be based on what is actually in place." And for the first time since I arrived, no one tried to redirect the conversation. No one tried to simplify it. Because now, there was nothing left to reinterpret. Only the truth. And it had already been revealed. No one rushed to fill the silence after that. The room did not collapse into arguments or raised voices the way people expect when control shifts this abruptly. Instead, it settled into something far more revealing. Stillness. The kind that forces everyone to sit with what cannot be undone. My brother was the first to move, but not in the way he had before. He stepped back from the table, not claiming space, but creating distance, like he needed room to think without being watched. His confidence had not disappeared completely, but it had changed shape. It was no longer built on assumption. It was trying to rebuild itself on something real, and that takes time. "So what now?" he asked, his voice lower, not confrontational, but no longer certain. I did not answer immediately. I let the question exist for a moment, because it was not just a question for me. It was a question for everyone in that room. My mother looked at me next, her expression softer than it had been all day, but not weak. Just, aware in a way she had not allowed herself to be before. "We were trying to keep things simple," she said quietly. I met her gaze, not dismissing her, not agreeing with her, just acknowledging the intention without letting it define the outcome. "Simple is not always honest," I replied gently. My father remained seated, his posture no longer authoritative, but grounded, like he had finally stepped out of the version of this situation that had been shaped around him. "We should have had this conversation sooner," he said. That was the closest anyone had come to saying it directly. I inclined my head slightly. "Yes," I said. "We should have." The girlfriend stood still beside the table, her earlier composure replaced by something quieter, more careful. She was no longer leading the conversation. She was listening to it, measuring it, understanding where her role began and where it ended. "Then we proceed with full transparency," she said after a moment, her tone steady, but now entirely aligned with the reality in front of her. "Nothing moves forward without all parties involved." I nodded once. "That would be appropriate," I said. My brother exhaled slowly, his frustration no longer directed outward, but inward, like he was recalculating everything he thought he understood. "This is going to change the timeline," he said. I looked at him calmly. "It already has," I replied. And that was the truth. The timeline they had built no longer existed. Not because I had interrupted it, but because it had been incomplete from the beginning. My mother reached for the edge of the table, her fingers resting lightly against it, grounding herself in something physical. "We never meant to make you feel excluded," she said. I held her gaze for a moment, then answered with the same calm clarity I had carried from the moment I walked in. "Feeling excluded is not the issue," I said softly. "Being excluded is." No one argued with that. Not this time. My father stood slowly, the movement deliberate, not rushed, and looked at each of us in turn before speaking again. "We correct this properly," he said. "No shortcuts. No assumptions." I inclined my head slightly, accepting the statement without needing to reinforce it. It was no longer something I had to push. It was something they had to carry. I reached for my keys then, not abruptly, not as a gesture of leaving in anger, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion for now. "I will stay the night," I said calmly. "We can contact the attorney in the morning." My father nodded. My mother exhaled softly, relief and uncertainty mixing in a way that felt honest for the first time that day. My brother did not respond, but he did not need to. The shift in him was already visible. And the girlfriend, for all her earlier control, simply stepped back slightly, allowing space where she had once taken it. I turned toward the hallway, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward with the same steady presence I had maintained from the beginning. As I reached the doorway, I paused for just a second, not to look back, not to check their reactions, but to acknowledge something silently to myself. Nothing I had said that day was loud. Nothing I had done was aggressive. And yet everything had changed. Because control does not always come from force. Sometimes, it comes from clarity. And clarity, once revealed, does not need to defend itself. It simply remains. I continued down the hallway without looking back, because I already knew what they were seeing behind me. Not the version of me they had planned around. Not the one they assumed would stay quiet. But the one who had finally decided that being present was not the same as being included, and that silence, once broken, does not return to what it was before. And that was the moment I understood something I should have known much earlier. They had not been planning their future. They had been planning around my absence. And now that I was no longer absent, everything they thought they controlled had to be rebuilt with me in it, whether they were ready for that or not.